Hello, we are back. I'm Steve, and this, of course, is Brian, the author of The Law and Men. Uh, Brian, I found chapter two, uh, a good read. It's on divorce. Can you explain further into that?
Sure. And chapter two highlights probably one of the main reasons why I did this. I want to make it clear too. One of the things I was very careful about in this book was, in the last episode I was talking about how certain authorities feed on this resentment. And I certainly didn't want to be guilty of doing anything like that in this book. This is definitely not an anti-woman book. This is not, I don't try to portray women as privileged. I disagree with that whole concept of privilege, which is another discussion for another time. But I wanted to be very careful in this book. I wanted to address issues that I think really are hurting people. And I think one of the things that has been the most destructive to our society in the last maybe 50 or so years, maybe more, has been the way we deal with divorce. The way we deal with divorce has destroyed families. I think a lot of the mental health, crime, drug use, other dysfunction that you see in our society is related to broken homes, which in turn is a result of our terrible way we deal with marriage and divorce. And the way we arrived at this destructive situation is once again based on this false understanding of history. There's a lot of history in this book because I think a lot of our misunderstandings about history led to this situation. One of the points I make, this idea that women were oppressed within marriage led to the way we do no-fault divorce now. And I think it's done, as I said, it's done incredible harm, not just to men, but to women as well, and of course to families.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you went into the history of divorce. There was one such case I highlighted where I might say her name wrong. Lady Westmouth. She succeeded in having her estranged lord imprisoned in the king's bench for failure to pay her debts for food, clothing, household purchases, and rent. And I know it's not that extreme anymore. However, that goes in to show how it first started off, right?
Well, the point of sharing those examples was that I was trying to drive the point home that men had responsibilities in marriage too. It wasn't just these burdens that were placed on women. Now, look, obviously times and circumstance change and laws need updating. The role of women changed in a lot of ways, and in many ways that was entirely appropriate and a positive thing. I certainly don't suggest that, but suggest that it wasn't. But if you look at the way our law developed, these burdens that were placed on men, they lasted long after many of the onerous requirements of the law were abolished for women. And I don't suggest, again, I'm trying to be fair to women in this, I don't suggest that some of these laws weren't unfair, or maybe not unfair when they were first adopted, but kind of outlived their usefulness, and changing circumstances did indeed make them oppressive. But the law was typically good about adjusting. I talk about the Married Women's Property Acts. I talk about, even before that, the exceptions in the law that women could take advantage of to avoid some of the harsh consequences of the common law of coverture and all that. So, but the point I want to drive home is men had responsibilities as well, and those were consequential responsibilities. And the example that you brought up, the specific obligation there, which is one of the biggest themes in the book, is that the law had imposed upon men a duty to provide for their wives and their children. Men who failed in that regard faced serious consequences. We forget that. People don't bring that up, and they, that duty and obligation had enormous impact on other areas of the law as well.
Yeah, and yeah, it's good that you pointed out that in most cases in society, and even still to this day, it's still the in most households the responsibility of the man to be the breadwinner. It's expected at times within society, what most of society expects, not all of society. But yeah, the man is looked down upon then if he can't provide the resources for his family, and how this in turn goes more also into court with how with child support payments, and I can't even imagine child support payments that some men have to make, and I'm not sure how fair it is or how not fair it is, because in my the way I think child support payments should only be used for the child and what the child needs. And in some cases, you have, like I've read about elsewhere, you have men paying buttloads in child support payments, but does that money really go towards the child? Like, I know of like really rich people we read about at times who their child support payments are humongous. And does a child really need that much money within a month, on themselves? And that's kind of my um, question too, at times.
Well, sure, and that's a very good question. I mean, the issue. So our laws. Here's the thing. Since probably the late '60s, maybe more into the 1970s, our laws were started to be written in a gender neutral way. The goal of alimony and property division and all that stuff, it went from one of supporting a wife to trying to make the parties who divorce financially independent of each other. But the problem with that goal is that, as you said, society still, and I offered, I think it was a Gallup or a Pew Research, one of those, in support of the idea that society still thinks of men, that's their responsibility to be the breadwinner. So the result, of course, is that while women certainly in some situations end up having to pay child support, they're they're far less likely to be incarcerated for not paying child support, and more men. Even though there was a statistic I shared, it was 40% of households have a female as the primary breadwinner, and yet men only receive 3% of maintenance awards and whatnot. Now, to get to your question specifically about child support, that is also an issue because, again, you hand over all this money to the other spouse, who usually is a female, and they've gotten a little stricter with it here in Illinois, but there's not a great way to ensure that those resources are being used appropriately. And even if there was, you still have the problem of where with no-fault divorce, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have no-fault divorce, I explain that in the proposal I make at the end of the chapter, but the way we do no-fault divorce, there's no, for the party who leaves for no reason, there's no consequence for them. So they can just tear a household apart, receive all this compensation, and I mean, that's just it's a terrible thing to be in that position.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. No, I just found this chapter extremely important for people to read, and I mean, it's it makes great points, and it's easy to read. There's not a lot of legal jargon you have to look up, so I like the read. So, is there anything else you want to say about this chapter before we end?
Yes. Here's one thing I would say about this, too, and again, I want to drive the point home. It's not an anti-woman book. I do think, to the extent that I've talked a lot about history and trying to give proper context for it, I do this for legitimate purposes because, again, I think history is weaponized. I don't know if you remember, one of the things that I brought up was the issue of women and credit. And I know I'll see this even on like Facebook. A lot of some of whom aren't even really like feminists, they'll post this stuff like, only 50 years ago or even in the 1970s, like women couldn't get credit cards and stuff. And there's never a discussion about the complicated legal doctrines behind that led to that. As I pointed out, women were a credit risk because of the doctrine of necessaries, and that example that you gave at the beginning of this presentation, where men could be sent to debtor's prison for this, and then the complicated interaction of those doctrines and the exceptions to them meant that creditors couldn't, in many cases, creditors couldn't recover debts from married women. As late as I point out, as late as 1972. A woman in New Jersey tried to use this doctrine to get out of paying a hospital bill. So obviously creditors didn't have sexist reasons for making life difficult for married women. There were complicated doctrines behind this that led to that. The problem is when women hear this stuff now, again, this fills them with anger because they're thinking, well, look at this. Men were trying to control us and keep us down, wouldn't even let us have credit cards, and had to get my husband's permission to sign off on a loan. Well, yeah, that's because he could get sent to debtor's prison for not paying your debt. So there was a complicated legal doctrines behind this stuff. There's never a discussion about that sort of thing, and that's why I wrote this, because that sort of thing just drives me crazy. It frustrates me that there's such an emphasis on the way that the law and the way that society put burdens on women, but there's never a discussion about how those matters also affected men.
That's a good point. Well, that is a wrap on this episode. Thank you so much for coming on again.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Okay, anytime.